We know what to do with someone caught misappropriating funds. But when confronted with evidence of a systematic attempt to undermine the political system itself, we recoil in a general failure of imagination and nerve.
Gary Sick, an American diplomat, wrote a book called The October Surprise, in which he argued that the Reagan team seems to have basically meddled in the situation to make sure that the hostages didn't get released before Election Day.
Gary Sick was a member of the Carter administration and on the staff of the National Security Council from August 1976 to April 1981. According to Mr. Sick's congressional testimony, quote, "In the course of hundreds of interviews in the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East, I have been told repeatedly that individuals associated with the Reagan-Bush campaign of 1980 met secretly with Iranian officials to delay the release of the American hostages until after the presidential election. For this favor, Iran was rewarded with a substantial supply of arms from Israel." End quote. According to Mr. Sick, low-level intelligence operatives and arms dealers are no Boy Scouts. End quote. Their accounts were not identical, but on the central facts they were remarkably consistent. Because of my past government experience, I knew about certain events that could not possibly be known to most of the sources. Yet their stories confirm these facts. Again, quoting Gary Sick, "From October 15th to October 20th, 1980, events came to a head in a series of meetings in Paris. Accounts of these meetings vary. There is, however, widespread agreement on a number of points. 1. William Casey, Reagan's campaign manager, was a key participant. 2. Iranian representatives agreed that the hostages would not be released prior to the presidential election on November 4th. 3. In return, Israel would serve as a conduit for arms and spare parts to Iran." Quote, "At least 5 of the sources who said they were in Paris in connection with these meetings insist that George Bush was present for at least one meeting. 3 sources say they saw him there. Former President George Bush denied being in Paris." According to Sick, immediately after the Paris meetings, things began to happen. Iran publicly shifted its position in the negotiations with the Carter administration, disclaiming any further interest in receiving military equipment. Again, according to Sick, between October 21st and October 23rd, Israel sent a plane load of F-4 fighter aircraft tires to Iran in contravention of the U.S. boycott and without informing Washington.
There was a congressional investigation into this claim eventually. It was grossly inadequate. It was a real whitewash. A lot of questions were never even entertained, much less answered.
In 1991, a congressional committee, led by Democratic Congressman Lee Hamilton, declared there to be no credible evidence linking Reagan's team with a delay in the hostages' release. In 2 contemporaneous magazine articles, charges of an October surprise were discounted. According to Mr. Sick, quote, "After listening to the evidence, one of the former hostages I spoke with said simply, 'I don't want to believe it. It's too painful to think about.'" Whatever the truth of the October surprise may be, what is undeniable is that the story is a career graveyard for journalists seeking to work in the corporate mainstream.
If you read what the hostages themselves had to say later in their various reminiscences of the experience, and you read some of the press coverage in depth, you find that the Iranians who were guarding the hostages had their stopwatches out. I mean, they were waiting for a particular moment to let those hostages run into the field of vision of the photographers who were all there waiting to take their picture.
Do you agree with this statement? Whatever is regularly broadcast is the definition of what is news. Or do you have another definition?
That is a good question because, yeah, I mean, if it happens but you don't hear about it, did it happen?
But by and large, on the right at least, media and concern about media is at the top of the list. Republicans and the right wing mobilize, they organize, they train people to be in the media. Right-wing foundations spend money on media programs. They fund and subsidize a media presence to create an environment friendly to the views of a real minority in our country by actual numbers.
In 1971, Lewis Powell, a corporate lawyer, was 2 months from being nominated to the Supreme Court by President Nixon. He wrote a memorandum expressing his concerns about how consumer activists and progressives were infecting the general population with an anti-corporate bias. This treatise circulated among a number of wealthy industrialists. One of them was Joseph Coors, who in 1972 provided initial financing of $250,000 for the Heritage Foundation. So began the neo-conservative movement to influence the media.
What we've seen since the mid-1970s is that all the great conservative foundations devoted almost all their money to ideological warfare. So much of journalism depends on who the source of the story is. And so you've seen the creation of these foundations or institutes in Washington, like the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, that basically are extraordinarily well-funded groups.
Reclusive billionaire Richard Mellon Scaife funds many of the right-wing think tanks. He also underwrote the Arkansas Project, a 4-year multi-million-dollar effort to investigate President Clinton. What has happened is resident fellows at the think tanks are paid to create rationales for predetermined economic and political positions, much like it was done in the old Soviet Union. The truth of the matter is that billions of dollars are being spent to convince the public that their interests and those of the corporations are the same.
The first few times they employ one of these right-wing experts, they'll be called from the conservative American Enterprise Institute or from the conservative Cato Institute. But over time they just drop that. And pretty soon it's just from the Cato Institute. And pretty soon it's just analyst. If you're a source and you can have someone weigh in on trade deals, on Supreme Court appointments, on tax bills, giving your perspective, if you've got a series of people who sound like they know what they're talking about of all sorts of degrees, you can really influence the news.
Powell singled out commercial TV and the judiciary as areas to influence. TV because it shapes people's minds. The judiciary because many crucial decisions are made by the courts.
We have always had an unrealistic view of our judiciary. We don't hold our judges and our judiciary in general to the same standards of reporting as we do the legislative branch or the executive branch. There's much less coverage.
If the Supreme Court had done for Al Gore what it did for George Bush, I give you a 100% guarantee that I would have written the same identical book, The Betrayal of America. 5 members of the United States Supreme Court committed, in my opinion, and I feel very strongly about this, one of the biggest and most serious crimes in American history when they stopped the recount in Florida, took the election away from the American people, and handed it to George Bush. And in a fair and just world, these 5 justices belong behind bars as much as any American white-collar criminal who has ever lived. The mainstream media, they don't even want to talk about what the court did anymore. Their position is, and they've made it very, very clear, the election is over with. We've moved on to covering other matters. Now, mind you, and this is not to defend President Clinton, but this is the same group, the mainstream media, who pursued Clinton not just day after day, not just week after week, not just month after month, but year after year. These 5 justices are ardent Federalists, states' rights advocates. And they've said over and over again, we let state courts interpret state law. December the 8th, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a manual recount. The recount started the following morning, a Saturday, December 9th, 8 o'clock. At that point in time, Bush's lead had shrunk over Gore to 154 votes. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Justice Antonin Scalia steps in with an emergency order supported by the 4 other justices. He said, we got to stop this recount because if it continues, it could, quote, threaten irreparable harm to George Bush, unquote. So even though the election had not yet been decided, the incredible Scalia was presupposing that Bush had won the election, and any recount that showed that Gore had won would threaten irreparable harm to George Bush. Now, if that doesn't show that these justices were trying to steal the election for George Bush, what in the world would?
We're supposed to believe as Americans that all judges have some sort of saint-like qualities, that they're not political in any way, and that we can't even discuss it.
Justice Clarence Thomas's wife works for the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., that assisted Governor Bush in his transition to power.
We don't look at their financial holdings. We don't look at the trips they take to conferences sponsored by ideological groups that want them to rule certain ways.
The night of the election, November 7th, Sandra Day O'Connor's at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C. with her lawyer husband, John. Dan Rather comes on the air at 8 o'clock and announces that it looks like Florida's going for Al Gore, whereupon O'Connor blurts out, "That's just terrible." She was angry, she was upset. The Wall Street Journal found 3 witnesses at the party to confirm that story. Newsweek found 2. Both the Wall Street Journal and Newsweek went to Sandra Day O'Connor for a comment. She declined comment.
Sat at his computer.
Eugene Scalia is widely considered to be one of the most qualified lawyers ever nominated to the post.
The ties that bind Scalia and Bush's lawyer Ted Olson, who argued before the Supreme Court, come together in the Federalist Society, a judicial group with close ties to corporately funded think tanks. Society members like Judge Santel in turn reject media regulation. Conservative judges have ruled that constraining the reach of media corporations violates their free speech rights.
If you read the First Amendment, there's no question but that free speech rights are rights that belong to citizens. They're individual rights. They're our rights. In the 70s, we started to get this new idea of commercial free speech. This is a very, very peculiar notion, commercial free speech, because what it does is it casts corporations, corporate entities as persons, which they're not. I mean, they're not people. You can't find their graves anywhere, unfortunately.
The First Amendment has been warped so that we understand it now as a way to essentially allow people who own media license to do whatever they want to do with the media that they own, with the property that they buy. The First Amendment becomes a barrier to understanding our responsibilities in a democracy.
Free speech, when you're talking about the media, it's just a fundamentally disproportionate right. My speech is equal to and as free as the speech of AOL Time Warner when they have this platform of access to the world that, I'm one person.
Somehow, the freedom to inform the general public has become the exclusive right of media corporations.
Giving them free speech rights was a perverse move. And in fact, it was the kind of thing that conservatives, rock-ribbed conservatives, had ruled out, as recently as the 40s.
During the Clinton administration in 1996, behind closed doors, the rules of the airwaves were rewritten. In radio, all regulation was literally thrown out. Small independent stations were bought up. Localism disappeared. Companies like Clear Channel went from owning a few stations to owning over 1,100 and dominating whole markets.